In this session we're going to talk about the issues involved in sample surveys. Let's start by asking, what is a survey? Well, at the most general level, the term survey can be applied to any fact-finding study. Any fact-finding study is conducting a survey. However, we mean it more systematically. We mean a survey to have some sort of rigorous, defined sample. We define the sample before we start. We define how we're going to select the sample. We define the population. We know the population the sample is going to be drawn from. And we also specify how we're going to seek the information, how the sample will be drawn, how the sample will be analyzed. So when we consider a survey, we have something more systematic in mind, not just a fact-finding study. Now, we need to distinguish between censuses and surveys. It's the use of a sample which distinguishes a survey from a census. So the use of a sample distinguishes a survey from a census. We have three terms here: sample, survey, and census. The survey is the systematic approach to collecting information, as I said earlier. And if we have a sample, that's what distinguishes it, distinguishes a survey from a census. In a census, it's an attempt is made, or there is an attempt made to obtain information from every member of the population. So a census is when every item in the population, or every member of the population, is queried or is surveyed. It doesn't have to be people. It could be items on a production line. Instead of taking a sample to assess the quality of the output, a census would be when every item of output is checked. So a census is when everything is checked. A survey, only some, and they are selected systematically. Now, the purposes of a survey. Well, the purpose of a survey is to enable information to be obtained about the population from which the sample has been drawn. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get an insight into the population by drawing a sample. Perhaps conducting a census would be too expensive or too time-consuming. So we use sample data. By and large, we use sample data. Now, the purpose of the sample is to estimate some features of the population, perhaps to test some hypothesis about the population, or it could be to test relationships between different features of the population. The selected population may relate to many aspects of human activity and knowledge. So when we talk about population here, the population could be the number of people, it could be the characteristics of people, people with very good performance in examinations, or it could be people who have joined the armed forces, or people who have run the marathon, whatever. The point is, they have some particular aspect about their lives which make them interesting and make them the relevant population. It depends on what we're inquiring into. It depends on the nature of the survey. Surveys can be categorized as these seeking factual information, e.g. the proportion of house owners in the general population. That would be a fact. Seeking factual information. Or those concerned with the measurement of opinions and attitudes. for example, market research and political opinion polls. So we have two types of surveys. One, factual, looking for perhaps proportions of the population who do or do not do certain things, or who own or do not own certain things. Those are factual bits of information. And we also have attitudinal surveys to find out people's attitudes towards certain changes in society, or changes to a product, or to certain proposals. We have ways of trying to assess the attitudes of people towards those changes. So market research and political opinion polls use attitudes and seek to measure opinions regarding certain issues. And those would be the main purposes of surveys. As a matter of interest, surveys have been around for quite some time. Modern approaches to surveys began in Britain in the second half of the 19th century. These related to surveys of poverty and the living conditions of poorer people. The surveys of Mayhew in 1861 and Booth in 1899 into the 1900s in London, and Rowntree in 1902 in York, are the earliest significant examples of surveys. So they go back quite some time. The way in which people were chosen to participate in the early surveys was very unscientific. And the first major survey to take sampling methodology seriously were those by Bowley in 1912. So the idea of asking opinions or trying to work out facts about the population go back a long way. Go back to almost the mid-1800s. Surveys are widely used in the United States, or were used in the United States widely in the 1960s. This is where they became really popular, and it spread out from there to what we've got today. The Gallup poll, for example, in 1936 is well known in the context of political polls and market research applications. So the Gallup poll is very well known as a survey company. Survey work advanced because of advances in computer technology that permitted sophisticated sampling from extensive electronically stored sampling frames. Well, as we surrender more and more of our information to online companies, the sampling frames become bigger, and there's more opportunity for people working in the computer and marketing and the surveying business to get access to information through databases and to conduct surveys electronically without need even of seeing the people face to face. It also permitted sophisticated data processing and analysis survey work, and has continued to grow at an astonishing rate and now covers most aspects of life and knowledge. So we have these surveys into everything just about, simply because there's so much information about us available nowadays. Not only do the computer people have access to the databases, but they've also got access to very sophisticated analytical tools. These tools include quite elaborate statistical packages that are able to process large amounts of information very quickly. Again, that was not available in the past. So I suppose we live in a world in which there is more and more information being processed and more surveys being conducted, even without us knowing about them. There are also government surveys. The government collects data for a variety of purposes. The General Household Survey, for example, and the Family Expenditure Survey in the UK. These are particularly well known and important because the results provide weights used in the Retail Price Index. What these surveys do is to see what items are important to us as consumers, as citizens, as people living in the country. How do we spend our money? What items are important? How much do we spend on energy? How much do we spend on travel? How much do we spend on food? And so on. So that the government can assess the importance of each of these areas of expenditure. There are also government social surveys to try to determine how particular changes in an area may affect the local community, or how social surveys into the welfare of children, or social surveys into the health or the health provision for the elderly, or whatever. So we have government conducting social surveys as well. And then we of course have market research surveys. Market research has been one of the biggest areas of growth in survey work. This is the big growth area and has been for probably the last 30, maybe even 40 years. This involves being surveyed by post, by telephone, or by being stopped in the street to participate in research. Companies try to get feedback from customers or potential customers about a product or about a proposed product. And all sorts of techniques are used to try and get people to participate in these surveys. Sellers and producers need to know what segment of the population is interested in the product. The survey may inquire into what they think of the quality and the price of the product. This is information being fed back to the producer, who really wants to know what people think of the product and its price and its quality and who it's aimed at and its packaging, and they need to know information. How is the product being received in the market? How do customers see it? Large organizations might have their own staff to carry out such work, but increasingly more and more of it has been done through agencies, specialized agencies who take on the work to conduct the survey on behalf of clients, industrial clients. There's also audience research. For effective advertising, companies need to know the relative popularity of different forms of media. This will enable companies and marketing agencies to determine the best marketing channels. So we have the National Readership Survey, for example. These are used to assess what people are reading. We have television advertising research surveys who carry out research in connection with commercial television. So before advertisers place advertisements in certain media, they want to know how successful, or try to estimate how successful the advertisement will be. Advertising is expensive, and they need to have some sort of feedback as to how many people will see the advertisement and how many people that are relevant to them are likely to see it at that particular time. Audience research is important to all broadcasting organizations to enable them to know which programs are popular and which are not. Popular programs can obviously charge more for advertisements. So audience research is important. Such knowledge is important for decisions about which programs to make or which programs to drop. So It's through audience research that the companies know which programs are popular, and hence the ones which will attract advertising agencies to place advertisements, and which programs are not popular, because the advertising agencies will not want to be involved with those programs. So for example, you would expect at peak time, perhaps 7 o'clock in the evening, 8 o'clock in the evening, you'd expect advertisements to cost more on television compared to, let's say, advertisements placed at 3 o'clock in the morning. Most people are in bed. Most people are asleep, so advertisements at that time will be much cheaper than at the peak time. Likewise, if there's a big event on, for example the World Cup in football, advertisements may be very expensive. In America during the Super Bowl, advertisements are extremely expensive. But on other occasions they may be a lot cheaper, and at certain times very cheap indeed. Audience research into radio listening requires particular care. The radio may be on in the background and may not be, or it may be, the focus of attention. So radio research is particularly difficult because people may not be listening to it. It may be background. It may be creating an atmosphere in the background as people work, for example, or as people relax. They're not particularly listening to the radio station. It's background music. Nonetheless, the companies need to know about how popular the music is, or how popular the programs are, and they need to know also what's the peak time for people listening to those channels, radio channels. Now, public opinion polls. Well, political opinion polls began with Gallup in 1936, as I said earlier. Governments and the press are constantly interested in public opinion, particularly the government, because it wants to be popular. And the press wants to know what the public opinions are, because that's what will influence the stories they carry in their papers, so they can sell more papers. Opinions on all matters are important, but some matters are more important than others. So of all the issues that concern the people, some will be pressing. It may be if the country is going to go to war, or if the rate of inflation has just been published and it's very high, or if unemployment is increasing. And so the opinions of people about all sorts of issues are important. And these are important to the government, but they're also important to the press, because it influences the way the stories will appear in the newspapers or on the media. Now, there are problems with these polls. Respondents may, for example, deliberately misinform the interviewer. With public opinion polls, as with market research indeed, respondents may not be honest, and that will bias the results. It will lead to false information. As to why people would want to do that is difficult to say, but that's the world in which we live. People may deliberately misinform the interviewer. It would be far preferable if they said they didn't wish to participate. But instead, they do participate, but give false information. It's wrong. It's morally wrong, but people do it. People may be unsure of their own opinions, or may change their minds frequently. It's often the case. Particularly if people don't have an expertise in the area. Someone untutored in economics, for example, may be confused about what inflation is. So a survey asking people their opinions about inflation may not yield very accurate results, because people are not sure exactly what inflation is. There may be many don't knows. They don't know their true opinion. One day they believe this, the next day they believe the opposite. They're not quite sure about things, and therefore the don't knows are a major issue. So on public opinion polls, we often get the results that X% of the population believe strongly that the government should do something, Y% believe the government should not do something, and Z% believes nothing. They don't know. Well, if that proportion is big, that's a problem for policy makers and for decision makers. There are also housing surveys, surveys carried out to assess housing needs. These surveys may focus on the private rented sector and collect facts and opinions about this sector from the respondents. There may be issues on objectivity and bias in the conduct of these surveys. Housing surveys, when people have a vested interest in the product that's being assessed, they sometimes may give false information, misleading information, if you like, non-factual information. There's no reason for them to hold a belief that they do. It's perhaps a prejudice. So care has to be taken with housing surveys that the people giving the information, the people being interviewed, are not grinding an axe for the private rented sector or against it. It can go either ways. There are lots of sociological surveys. Academic research in the area of sociology tends to be based on survey work. Sociological surveys may inquire into a wide range of human activities, such as aspects of domestic life, such as lifestyle and family structure, or look into community issues such as travel, policing, the environment, many areas. So there's a lot of work, sociological work, conducted mainly through universities into many aspects of life in the community. And these surveys tend to be published and may form the basis of subsequent, later surveys on a more extensive level. The methods include, well, all sorts of areas. For example, published data may be used. Published data is data collected automatically for one purpose, may be used for a different purpose. Taxpayers. The number of taxpayers in the country is a good indicator of the number of people working, for example. Participant observation methods, where the investigator becomes involved as an observer and may either observe the situation directly with his or her own eyes and make notes, or may actually participate in the activity to gain an even greater insight into it. All of these methods have problems. All of these methods have really big problems which limit their applicability and their usefulness, but they are used. We also have questionnaires. Questionnaires is a big topic which is dealt with in separate videos. Interviews, also in separate videos, and focus groups where people are invited in and a facilitator, a person, asks questions to the group and tries to get some insight into what the group think about certain issues. The sociological surveys, well, there are surveys on nutrition, for example. In the early part of the 20th century, looked into whether poorer families were having their nutritional needs met. So in the UK there have been many sociological surveys, and some looking at nutrition to see if the poor had healthy diets. In the post-war years, the emphasis gradually changed to looking at what foods people wanted to buy, as opposed to what they were buying or what they were forced to buy. But in the post-war years, that sociological survey the emphasis changed to what people wanted to buy. There are sociological surveys into health. Many surveys have been conducted into the effects of different aspects of lifestyle on health. For example, the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, the levels of activity and heart disease, or alcoholic consumption and liver failure. So there have been many surveys conducted in these areas to get an insight into the effects of one on the other. In terms of education, well, surveys may inquire into the relationship between social background, IQ, and educational achievement. There's also been work into the effectiveness of and the process implied in teaching methods. So how successful are teaching methods, and are the appropriate teaching methods being used in schools? Surveys may investigate the organisation and the management of education as well. Are the schools properly organised? What's the role of the principal or the headmaster? What's the role of the deputy head? How is the organisation worked out? How are communications facilitated within the school, and so on? So there are many surveys covering areas such as these. There are also surveys into leisure. For example, tourism surveys. Where do people like to go on their holidays, and where do they like to spend their recreational time? Leisure activities, leisure resources. Are there enough leisure resources to meet people's needs? For example, are there enough football pitches in urban areas? Are there enough golf courses, or are there enough tennis courts or swimming pools, or whatever? What are the resources? And indeed, what is the participation rates in sports? How many people participate? What proportion of the population actively participates in sports? We also have travel. Surveys looking at transport and the environment. Attitudes about modes of transport. Go by train, go by car, cycle, walk. How much transport has been provided, the transport provision. Are there enough buses in the cities, or what are the alternative modes of transport that could be developed? Perhaps there's a green agenda. Perhaps we want the cities to be more efficient in the use of energy, and perhaps lots of buses going around polluting the atmosphere is deemed not very good. Other people would say it's very good because they are the most convenient form of transport. So there is a big debate about what's good and what's not good. And what's the cost of transport? Is it too expensive, and how can the costs be managed and controlled? There are also surveys on crime. The problem with crime surveys is that only those caught can be surveyed. Obviously, the people who are not caught committing crime or having committed crime, those people can't be surveyed. So the people who are caught can be surveyed as to why they did it, or what led them to commit the crime, and also what are the types of crime reported, and what do the victims think about the crime and the crime rates. And this feeds back to policing, and so that the police may take appropriate measures and allocate resources where there is the biggest areas of concern. So in this class we've looked at many different types of survey, and we've distinguished samples and censuses, and then gone on to talk about the different types, various different types of surveys that can be conducted. And that's all I want to do in this session, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.